and gentlemen, my name's Kevin Graham and welcome to SCREAMACELICA, the football, music and culture show where we talk to really cool people. Today, my guest is author David F. Ross, who has written 7 acclaimed books. Is it 7?
5.
5. Where did I get the 7 for?
Seven's okay. You know, like that means that I've now got to deliver on these 2.
Well, I saw on Twitter this morning.
There's a 6th one there finished.
The 6th one that's finished. So 5 acclaimed books, as you just told me, and he's also a well-known face on the Scottish literary scene. David, welcome to SCREAMACELICA.
Thanks very much. It's a wee bit awkward, you know, a Rangers fan being here in the heart of everything green and white, but I dressed up for the part.
I was about to say that you did have a green and white jumper on. It looks very like that Icelandic jumper up there.
Well, it's a link to something that we'll maybe talk about a wee bit later on, because this is a Paul Weller range of jumper for...
Nice.
Trying to think the name of the company that he designed it for. A couple of years ago.
My
kids bought me this. And
well, obviously we're going to be talking about the jam later on. That's how I've got my mod jumper on as well, just to keep us right and on theme. I think that's what they say in this game, So, for those who are just watching for the first time, the concept of this madness is this: we pick a year, the guest picks a year, then picks a game, then picks an album or a song from that year. It means something to you, and I have a look back at that year as well and pick a game and an album as well, and we discuss it. So that's exactly what we're going to do. That is SCREAMACELICA. But you've already said it, the elephant in the room, that you are the first Rangers fan to actually be on SCREAMACELICA.
I'm sort of honoured by that, I have to be honest. I'm hoping I'll be able to take away a pennant or something, you know, like we can trade something at the end of the game.
Aye, like we used to do in European ties. Aye, we can maybe get you something. We'll have a look for that. So, because that we do have a Rangers fan on, and because we're really good guys here, we've allowed you to pick a game where Rangers actually beat Celtic.
Right.
Which... we just had to do that,
There's bound to be one of them there.
Just to get other folk on. So tell us, what game have you actually picked?
The game that I picked is from 1979, which was the year that we were talking about as well. And it's the Drybrough Cup Final, where Rangers beat Celtic 3-1. It's funny when I you know, asking the question, why would you pick a game like that? There's a wee bit of a backstory here. I used to live in Bolton Drive, which is at the top of Mount Florida, just when you go down to Hampden. But my mum died when I was 7, early 70s, maybe 1971, I think. And we moved away. My dad eventually remarried someone from Ayrshire, and we moved down there. And that game was the first time I had actually been back to Hampden for a football match. I think I'd been in the stadium the time when Ali MacLeod drove round the pitch before we went to obviously go and win the World Cup.
We'd done the victory parade before we'd actually won the thing.
But this was the first, and I'd come into the stadium from a different direction. So this was the first time I'd actually been back for a game and had come off the railway station and gone past the house that I used to live in where my mum died, you know. And it was quite, it's a kind of weird feeling then at the time, and even now thinking back on it, that, you know, Rangers won that game, but fundamentally it's quite a kind of sad feeling about being in that context for the first time. So it's these things stay with you a lot. I think I was 15 at the time, and they kind of stay with you. Obviously, most other people will now think about that game for the Davy Cooper goal, even though hardly anybody's really seen it in the context of a proper commentary filming situation. But
it's interesting to see that everybody's got their own memories of Hampden, but obviously yours is very personal. Coming into this game, do you still get that feeling just now when you go back to Hampden?
Yeah, we my practice did the Hampden Vision for 25 years, so we were pretty heavily involved in the work that led up to the SFA deciding to stay at Hampden a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it was really emotional. You know, I think I've been to Hampden a lot of times since, but I think we the way we wanted to try and capture what that Hampden was about, rightly or wrongly, I felt it was right at the time, that it was the kind of natural home of Scottish football. And, you know, I guess when you look at it from an architectural point of view, you feel that you can always solve the problems. And I think we put forward a solution that would have solved all the problems. Whether they go forward with it or not, it's another matter altogether. But going back, and I did a wee voiceover at the beginning of the film that we pitched to the SFA, and it was about thinking emotionally about what a stadium represents.
Definitely.
And that's it's a personal thing. You know, everybody's got their own kind of connections with what football means to them and what the stadium is, but that one was particularly unique to me, I guess.
It is unique to you, and Hampden's unique to everybody that actually goes there. For me, I never got Hampden until I started going to the Scotland games. I'd been to cup finals and that, and always thought it was a pretty poor atmosphere. My first cup final was 1985 then, but you still thought, by the time when it was redone, when they put the seats in, you just went. And also as well, I spent a season there as a season ticket holder for Celtic, and it was one of the worst seasons ever. And I always think my judgment, I was 19 at that point, and my judgment of Hampden's always been clouded by that season. It was terrible round about. The club was a wee bit of the start of the Phoenix rising again at that point, but we still had to make that step. We had moved away from Celtic Park, and I always thought, I didn't get Hampden. I do not get the emotional attachment to Hampden until I started going to the Scotland games. And I realised it's a completely different atmosphere for the Scotland games. That's what it seems to be for cup finals. And
I mean, the negative aspects about it, and in 1979 there were a lot of negatives, you know. I think sometimes are forgotten about in the context of something like Lee Griffiths scoring those 2 goals against England, or, you know, one of the games I remember most, got absolutely soaked because the thing didn't have a roof at the time. Mo Johnson scoring for Scotland against France, we beat France 2-0. It was a Wednesday night, and you know, you get caught up in the emotion of the win of that game. And everything else kind of fades to the background. But you know, go to Hampden and watch your team getting beat, or watch a dispiriting Scotland team in a half-empty stadium. There's probably nowhere worse.
But then you look at it now recently against Israel. The game against Israel, the place was absolutely bouncing, and I do understand why the Tartan Army now go, Hampden is your home. We didn't want to move about the country. I really do understand it. No,
still needs to get fixed though. So Rod, if you're watching, give us a call. We've got it, Rod. It
definitely does need to get fixed. Definitely. No, you've mentioned 2 things there. You mentioned a Rangers fan. You mentioned Mo Johnson. That's 2 things in the first 5 minutes. I've got to have folk switching off. This style, it will get better, lads. It will get better. Now, folk are going to be asking, what's the Drybrough Cup? So for folk under 40, the Drybrough Cup was a pre-season tournament, which was played between 1971 and 1974, then was revived in 79 and 80. And it was basically conceived because the SFA wouldn't allow Drybrough to sponsor the League Cup or the Scottish Cup at that point. Can you remember how the teams qualified?
I think there were 3 rounds, quarter-final, semi-final and a final, and from memory I think it was the top 4 teams in the first division and the top 4 teams in the next division. Is that right?
Close. It was the top 4 highest scoring teams in both divisions. Complete and utter bizarre qualification material, but it actually just suits Scottish football that they have something as bizarre as that. Now, Aberdeen won it twice, Hibs won it twice, Celtic and Rangers both won it once, and we're going to talk about the time that Rangers did win it. But Celtic were runners-up 4 times in this tournament when I had a look back at it. So it's Saturday the 4th of August 1979. It's absolutely boiling. It's an absolutely roasting hot day. There's 40,608 have turned up to the game. And the teams that day I'm going to start with Celtic because we were absolutely rotten this day. So I'm going to read the Celtic team out first before I read the Rangers team out. Celtic team was Latchford, Snedden, McGrain, Aiken, McDonald, McAdam, Provan, McLeod, McCluskey, who was replaced by Bobby Lennox, Tommy Burns and Johnny Doyle. The Rangers team that day was McCoy, Miller, Dawson, Jardine, Jackson, Watson, Cooper, Russell, Parlane, Smith, Alec MacDonald, and is it John MacDonald?
John MacDonald.
John MacDonald.
Although was he on for the start? I thought
he was on for the start.
Young boy, aye.
John MacDonald was on for the start. He scored the first goal after 13 minutes.
That's right.
You've already mentioned Davy Cooper's goal. I was only 3.5 when this game was played, but I can remember. If somebody says to me the Drybrough Cup, the first thing I remember, first thing I think about is Davy Cooper's goal, and that coming from a Celtic fan will probably banish me for an awful lot of folk. But what is your memories of that day? What is your memories of that game? Because there's only 40,000 there, so when you actually do have a look at the footage that exists, Hampden is a bit sparse.
I went there. I was trying to think. 15. I didn't really go to many Rangers games at that time because I was playing football regularly at that point in Kilmarnock for youth teams like Kilmarnock Colts. I was playing for at the time, and most of my mates from then till now, weirdly enough, were Celtic fans. There was a lot that were Kilmarnock fans as well. I didn't really know that many people who were Rangers fans when we moved down to Kilmarnock.
Which is very weird with folk have got this idea of Ayrshire.
Yeah, I mean, I there's a lot of buses run now, and it would be predominantly more Rangers orientated, I would think, than Kilmarnock.
But I do remember Kilmarnock when they first came back in the Premier League having very big attendances and bringing large travelling supports to Celtic Park.
And I would occasionally go and see Kilmarnock, even though I was born in Glasgow and my folks were all Rangers fans and kind of diehard. My grandpa went to my grandpa, funnily enough, even though we originally lived in the East End, and my grandpa went to see Celtic winning the European Cup because I think he kind of thought that that's a fundamentally unbelievable thing for a team from Glasgow to do, and we'll maybe talk later on about attitudes to Rangers and Celtic rivalry and stuff like that. And I think I probably got a lot of this from my dad's side of the family, who were always of the view that, it's just a game. You know what I mean? I know it sounds like a cliche, but you can be passionate about supporting your own team, but it doesn't mean to say you can't have a laugh or a chat with people who support your rivals. So anyway, I found 3 mates from this football team I started playing with who were going to go to the game, and I went with them. And as I mentioned earlier on, I was probably quite subdued that day, I think, because I wasn't quite prepared for seeing the flat and the place I'd stayed in for the first time for a wee while. And so we went to the game in the Rangers end, and as I say, it kind of relaxed a wee bit after McDonald scored, Thinking back on it now, and you're right to highlight a pre-season tournament, it's effectively one of those things where nowadays you've got Arsenal coming up, and
you would, aye.
You know what I mean? It didn't really mean anything. The season hadn't started. Rangers were off the back of not that great a season previously, with Greg being a manager, and clearly they had players that were just finished after the Wallace era, and he should have cleared them out. Wee bit too much loyalty to some of them.
When I look at these two teams, I mean, growing up in the 80s, I'm having a look at the Celtic team, and I see guys like Aiken, who's a young laddie at that point. He must only be about 18, 19 at that point. You've got Danny McGrain, who just one of the best full-backs in the world at that time. You've got Sandy Jardine, who's another cracking full-back at that time. And you've got like Provan, McLeod, McCluskey for us, Tommy Burns, all guys who I remember through the 80s being really skillful players. And you look at the Rangers team, you've got Davy Cooper. Davy Cooper scores that goal. And I can't really comment on Cooper because obviously I'm a Celtic fan. But how highly was Cooper rated by the Rangers fans?
I mean, I think until maybe Laudrup came along, certainly Davy Cooper was my favourite player, and I didn't really know anybody who was my age who was interested in Rangers at that time who wouldn't have said the same thing, When I was a wee bit younger, before Cooper came along, Derek Parlane was my favourite player.
Aye.
I guess just because you can latch on to the goal scorers and stuff like that. But it's funny when you look back at clips now from that time and you try and contrast how people play now to how they played then, and it does look quite laboured, you know what I mean? But I look at that and think Cooper was maybe one of the only players from that time who looked comfortable enough on the ball to feel like he could have been a player at the highest level now, you know. It's a weird thing, you know, the older you get, the more you kind of latch on sometimes to nostalgia and think, oh, you know, look at football nowadays. You know, the Celtic team of the early 70s or Rangers at a certain point would wipe the floor with these. No, they wouldn't. You know,
nah.
It's just, you know, when I tell you a funny story.
It's a rubbish question.
Aye, but Cooper, I think Cooper was probably one of the only players I think that I've seen that feels like they fit in a football context in any era. George Best's the same, you know. Most of the Brazil team from 1970. It's a way of addressing the ball or moving it on, or it feels like it can adapt to any kind of coaching at any kind of time. But you know, I don't really have great to come back to your question. I don't really have great memories of the football being fantastic that day. In fact, if I'm being perfectly honest, never even saw the Cooper goal. You know, I'd either turned away or I was, you know what I mean. It was pretty close to the end of the game, and I remember getting back home and my dad said, "Oh, it's good one." You know, and people are already kind of talking about the Davy Cooper goal. What was it like? And I said, "Oh, it was phenomenal, Dad. You know, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, he must have beat about 5 players. The truth is, I never even actually saw it. And even if I had been watching the game and coming back to a criticism of Hampden, the Rangers end, it was miles away. You know, they were like that size, tiny."
The footage for behind the goals, and there is only footage for behind the goals, and it shows how poor the Celtic defending that was. But it's the speed of thought with Cooper, it's the skill with Cooper, and it's when the ball's dropping, Latchford's coming out, and it's the awareness of mind to actually put the ball into the back of the net, the way that he done it. I mean, he calmly strokes it into the back of the net. And when you look at guys like Cooper and even Davy Provan, it's like the socks are rolled down to the ankles. They always just look knackered. They always just looked at. There's that sort of unfitness, just looking at them. But that day as well, Sandy Jardine scores a great goal, which when you see the footage, you only see the end of it. You see him winning the ball at the edge of the box. Then there's a cut. Then he's in the Celtic box actually scoring. And these 2 goals have got mythical status now because of the lack of footage. Whereas we're sitting here and. The 2022, everything would be filmed. You get to watch angles. You get to watch pre-season games live now if you're willing to pay for it, and it's like a different time. The fact that these 2 goals have got mythical status. There was only 40,000 there, but I bet if you ask the number of Rangers fans now of a certain vintage would go, I was there that day.
But like Sex Pistols in Lesser Free Trade Hall.
Manchester, it seems to have got mythical status, this game and these goals, because it wasn't filmed. And even the Celtic fans now, I've spoke to Celtic fans about this game and say, oh, what a goal that was. We stood and applauded it. I'm going, I didn't think that would have happened at that point. But if you it's a pre-season game. It is a pre-season game. So, one thing I want to ask you, and it was always kind of Celtic and goalkeepers. You had Peter Latchford in goals for Celtic that day. Pat Bonner was on the bench for Celtic, soon to have over 500 games in that for Celtic. I've never seen Peter McCloy save anything. Can you confirm if Peter McCloy ever actually saved anything? What was he called? The Girvan Lighthouse? Was that was his nickname? Was it?
Aye, he was about 6'5" or 6'6" or something like that. It always looked like a really awkward kind of keeper. Do you know? I'm sure he must have saved something at some point. But you're right. I mean, I think you can think back to goalkeepers, you know, for either Rangers or Celtic, and there's a few phenomenal saves stand out, whether it's for us, whether it's Kloss or Gorham, or
Aye.
you know, you think of these goalkeepers and you immediately go to a particular point where they've made an incredible save, or they've kept, you know, they've changed the course of a game. Even McGregor to a certain extent. But you're right. I can't think of a single save that stands out from even the one man Shelton from Kenny Dalglish. You know,
Aye.
all of these keepers at that time. You know, there's things that you can think of, but poor old Peter. No.
It's the same with Pat Bonner. Everybody remembers Pat Bonner for the Italian 1990 World Cup. And if you ask somebody who was going during the 80s, well, can you remember a game where Pat Bonner was utterly fantastic? They struggle to remember. Aye. But if you say Pat Bonner, Italia 90s, penalty kick, shoot, then that. Some Celtic fans would say the night that we beat Ajax in Amsterdam in 81 was his greatest game. When you watch back that, he did actually make quite a few saves. But it's amazing how your perception actually changes of maybe we just didn't expect.
He was an awkward kind of goalie, you know, just because of the size and the length of the legs, and just never really looked comfortable, I think, you know. So, you know, I can't imagine, I may be doing him a disservice here, but I can't imagine that there would have been many Man of the Match awards for good old Peter during his lifetime with Rangers.
No, and we have a look at it from Pat Bonner's point of view as well. He played nearly 600 games for Celtic under numerous managers, so he must have had something, but again, it's perception. It's actually perception at that time. We would rather speak about flair players like Cooper, Davy Cooper and Tommy Burns and stuff like that, and you just didn't want to talk about the goalkeepers and the less attractive.
I wonder whether it's maybe also a wee bit, you know, goalkeepers nowadays are so much more part of the play generally. Every time, I mean, my abiding memory of Peter McCloy is every time he got it, he scalped it up the park, and because he was enormous, you know, he was basically kicking it from his own box to the next box every single time, you know, and he you know,
there's villains in the piece who can actually pick up the ball and bounce it for 5 minutes and no do nothing with it.
That imagining Peter McCloy in a context where there's a pass back now and he's having to dribble somebody, you know, it's just doesn't bear thinking about.
Maybe it's just the fact that guys like McCloy and Bonner weren't Hamish McAlpine, who seem to have a bit of extravagance about him, like when he was holding onto the ball for 5 minutes and receiving numerous back passes for Dave Neary.
I mean, I think he's probably the tail end of that generation that, you know, when you were at school, nobody wanted to be in goals, you know, and that was the last, it was either the tall kid or it was the one that couldn't do anything else that ended up in goals. And whilst, you know, obviously professional football is different, I think there's an element of that percolates all the way through, you know, that you could sometimes make an argument now that teams, I mean, Guardiola might make this argument, you know, you build a team from the back and you build it around a goalkeeper who's one of the 11 outfield players. You know, that just wasn't the case at that time. A wee bit the same as centre halves, you know. Centre half responsibility was to get it away from the goal. It wasn't to actually necessarily be part and parcel of how you build an attack, you know. Well,
we see Joe Hart standing 30 yards from his goal, being used to start passing moves now, and you're like, that is just, it's still even bizarre to watch.
And it's funny. It's funny the fact that his downfall, his fall from the position that he was in was probably because he was felt not to be good enough at that. You know, it's weird.
It's a whole concept of how football's changed over the years and how football was used. I mean, even when the pass back rule came in 1992, and it came in because of Italia 90 had the lowest goals scored of a World Cup, and FIFA decided we need to do something, we need to change something here. And you see the amount of keepers who are 80s goalkeepers still playing in the early 90s, having to go, I can't pick this ball up, and they're trying to kick the ball and they're missing it and all that. It's hilarious. some of the early Sky games, when you look at Dave Besant trying to kick the ball, and it is quite funny, but it's goalkeepers get a rough end of the stick, and it's just one of these things in my memory of, like, playing with my friends who were Rangers fans and that, I could never remember Peter McCloy actually ever saving anything. Or any of them go, Peter McCloy had a great game, or in goals and go, I'm Peter McCloy. Even the Rangers fans wanted to be Jim Leighton. When they went in goals, they went, put on their wee black and yellow gloves, like, I'm Jim Leighton. Well, you know, Peter McCloy, you look like... I'm Hamish McAlpine when they're swinging for the crossbar or something like that. You just didn't see that. How did you celebrate winning the Drybrough Cup then, when you went back to Kilmarnock?
Jesus, what did we do back in those days? Sweetheart Stout in the park, that was a normal nightly routine. Can't remember specifically, but probably out drinking when we shouldn't have been. Not smoking, I don't think, because I never really got into the smoking, and the drugs, lightweight though they were a wee bit for later. So I imagine just out kicking around. You know, I lived in Ontank at the time, so that was quite a tough place to grow up. So you had to have your wits about you, I think.
Aye, 1979, it's Britain's no the most glamorous of places at that point, especially even Scotland or Glasgow's not the most glamorous of places at that point as well. And the music that we'll talk to is a big thing for you. The game I want to talk about is the last game of that season. So we've got one of the first games of the season in August, so I want to go to May that season. What date in May was it? I can't remember. I think it was 10th of May. 10th of May. 10th of May 1980. And what is now known as the Riot Cup Final. It doesn't get... You search it on YouTube, Riot Cup Final. It comes up Celtic Rangers 1980 Scottish Cup Final. Now, coming out that Drybrough Cup game, reading the reports, everybody was predicting a fantastic season for Rangers. They were saying that Celtic are going to struggle. They couldn't handle Rangers' pace and power in the Drybrough Cup game. It didn't really turn out that way that season. No. Dundee United won the League Cup. Aberdeen pipped Celtic for the title by 1 point on the final day of the season. It was the first time a team outside Glasgow had won the league for 14 years. That was Ferguson's first league title with Aberdeen. With Dundee United obviously winning the League Cup, this was the start of Dundee United and Aberdeen becoming a major force in Scotland, but also in Europe. We've got to remember that as well. And Rangers finished 5th. That season, I'm laughing at that because I get to laugh at that. And he's lost it in European football and goal difference to Dundee United. Yeah. And strangely enough, St Mirren finished 4th.
That's right. Right.
So both teams are turning up to Hampden to win their first piece of silverware that season. Something that's unknown for about 14 seasons before that. Yeah. And Rangers are also turning up to try and get into Europe for the following season, because winning the Scottish Cup got you into the Cup Winners' Cup at that point. It was direct entry. What was your thoughts going into this game? Because Rangers were massive favourites going into this game. The reason being that Celtic had lost their 2 centre-halves, Roddy McDonald and Tom McAdam, and their backup Jim Casey, who I've never heard of, even though I'm a Celtic fan, was injured, meaning that Mike Conroy and Roy Aitken were our 2 centre-halves. And I spoke to my dad about this, and he says, nobody gave Celtic a chance going into this game.
Yeah, I do remember that. And I remember that it was a horrendous season for Rangers, particularly away from home. The statistics, I think, on points away from home were absolutely abysmal. And I think there was a bit of hope, a wee bit of expectation, but there was a bit of an undercurrent of desperation as well about it, I remember. And I think really difficult times for Rangers fans, because Greg, is a phenomenal servant to the club, but he wasn't a manager, and it was kind of becoming apparent at that time. I think he had too much loyalty to players that had been there for a long time, that were sort of, I don't want to say past it, but definitely past their best, and that season just, highlighted that, and only 2 seasons earlier they'd won the treble under Jock Wallace, but that should have been the end of it, I think, for a lot of them. It was just going too far, So I do remember that kind of expectation. You know, you look at, even now, you know, you look at, and the game's coming up on Wednesday night, you're sort of looking at, right, why would you try and predict a Rangers Celtic game when you don't know the starting lineups? Because it's everything, do you know? But with that one, when you knew that players that, and there was no squad rotation at that point, do you know what I mean? It was like, it was the same 11 every week, other than if they were injured or suspended or something. So losing 2 players at the back for Celtic is a big deal, and you think, right, okay, this is the best chance to salvage something from what's been otherwise a pretty terrible season.
I find it interesting you mentioned the Gregg thing there, and they went to John Gregg because obviously he was voted the greatest ever Ranger. That was years later, I think, and got the statue outside the stadium. But it was the same with Celtic after Stein. They went for McNeil, and it seemed to be, no, you go for a club legend to be your manager. And sometimes that's still relevant today. Like both teams, as we're talking, both teams have changed their both Celtic and Rangers have changed their manager in the last 12 months. And you always still get that element of the support to go, who do we look for?
I think different times, obviously, you know, you're looking back then at a manager that's, you know, going to be in the job with the big clubs for however long they're successful. Do you know, nothing then about 2-year contracts or a year rolling contract, we'll see how it goes. Do you know, everything's changed about that. So from that point of view now, why then would a reasonably bigger club with money to spend, regardless of whether it's in England or whether it's in Scotland, feel like you have to have someone who's Rangers minded or Celtic minded, or, you know, who understands the club? I've never really got that, to be honest. And this is an aside, it's got nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I thought one of the most interesting managerial changes Rangers have ever made was Le Guen, you know. And I think, I don't know the background to it, I only know what I've kind of heard, that it was kind of sabotage from inside, you know. I mean, that I think was the opportunity to take Rangers onto a slightly different level, a different mindset about the way they played. And it didn't work because I think didn't get the time, didn't really have the players, and there was a bit of self-sabotage going on. There inside.
Is a bit of self-sabotage, and from a Celtic point of view, we could probably say the same as with Ronnie Dyler.
Yeah.
Ronnie Dyler put in a lot of stuff that Brendan Rodgers actually then just amplified. But the fact it was Brendan Rodgers telling the same set of players, you have to do this,
it's a strange
rather
thing.
than Ronnie Dyler, but as you say, it's an outsider looking in. You can only say it's self-sabotage. Would I be right in thinking then that John Gregg was the manager of Rangers until Souness came along?
That's a good question. Souness was 85, 86 or something like that. I think it might have been, because, you know, the early 80s were the absolute rock bottom for Rangers. I mean, that was the years of 4,000 and 5,000 turning up at the games.
And you actually think about that now, he wouldn't have got 2 seasons now with that sort of finishing 5th, not getting into Europe, stuff like that. And he managed to last 7 or 8 years before Rangers eventually made the change. Bring it in Souness. I just find that concept now is completely alien to a lot of people who will be watching this.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you know, and it's not necessarily great, you know. There's no question money has changed and demeaned football across the world. You know, these decisions are being made for financial reasons. They're not necessarily being made for you know, what's right for the club or what's right for the long-term strategy for it. You know? Instant
gratification of the fans who want new shiny things
every
so often.
You know, I stand as guilty as anybody else in thinking, you know, how brilliant it was when David Murray was spending money, you know, bringing in players that were real names, you know. And you don't question, you know, that's where I think it's a wee bit unfair sometimes, the criticism when it goes bad, whether it's with Leeds or whether it's with Rangers, you know, and there's a bit of inferred criticism that the fans should have been more open. I mean, why should they be, you know?
That's a perfect example.
Well, they've got no concept or idea of how the club's being run and the structure of all that. They've got to take a lot of that for granted, you know. I think they won't now, but, you know, back then, what would ever have given you the instinct that all this was built on, you know, sand? Do you know what I mean? It's
as you say, it's the way that the press dressed up as well, especially a lot with the Rangers stuff. David Murray, I think it's very clear, David Murray owned the press, and he fed them the tidbits, and nobody asked the pertinent questions. Whereas the press done Celtic a decent turn in the 1990s by actually telling us how bad it was, and that got the fans. Oh, wait a minute, I mean, we actually need to do something here. It's the same way Hearts and Romanoff. You speak to Hearts fans now, they go, we knew that he was spending money that we didn't have, but it was bloody great. Because it was fantastic winning Scottish Cups, beating Hibs 5-1 in Scottish Cup Final. It's magic. And on another scale of it now, you've got the Newcastle fans who are now the richest club in the world. Somebody like me go, well, I didn't really like how you... your new owners,
how that money comes from, what they stand for.
But then the Newcastle fans we're sitting here recording this on January the 31st, deadline day. They'll be sitting glued to Sky Sports and they're going, who are we going to sign? Because they've now got that. And it's an innocent, and also these Newcastle fans are trying to defend the regime that's taking them over, and that's what the regime actually wants.
I mean, it's a really I mean, we're getting quite deep
here.
It's a really interesting question about why you get attracted to a football club in the first place, and why you stay attracted to a football club. You know, I think for most people, it's inbuilt and inherited. You know, certainly for me, and you go through that not really questioning that, because that's part of your identity and part of your relationship to your family. But then the older you get, you know, you would love it to be the fact that something that you identify with shares the same values that you have as an individual, but it's probably a bit kind of naive, you know, to think like that. Whether it's a political party or whether it's a football club, you know, they're not going to do that for you, because they're structured and run in a completely different way, and it's very, very difficult, you know. And I'm not going to run from the difficult things that Rangers have been involved in the last few years, or the things that I hold my head every time a statement comes out, because, you know, you think, why go into that? You don't need to, do you know? Just draw back. Where's the harm in that? But you're left in a position that, do you think, that's been part of my identity for 50 years, and it's something I inherited from my family, and my son's now got that because, you know, you talk about it, you take them to the games, you know. Do you walk away from all that? It's really difficult, you know? It
is really difficult, and being a football fan, it actually appeals to the most naive part of your brain. Because you're putting your hopes, your fears, your dreams in others' hands.
Absolutely.
Because of family or whatever it was. And it is very, very difficult. I find myself questioning Celtic more and more now, going, he's didn't actually represent what I actually represent, and that's more the people that run the club. I find myself getting more and more distant from what people would see the fanaticism, which is spending every penny that you've got to go and watch games. Now I'll go, you get my season ticket money, but that's it.
I think the tipping point is, are you investing too much of yourself into it? And by that I mean, has it become a cause that you can't see round, you know? That whole thing about, you know, that there's no mechanism whereby you can look into something and think that and be critical of it, even though you support it, do you know? And worryingly for me, and I think there are a lot of parallels between football clubs and political parties now, that's happening from a political point of view as well. You know, I was really political when I was younger, around this time actually, and we talk about the music, and it was a catalyst to a lot of that. 1979, but I feel like I was more critical of the Labour Party, even though I was a member and a supporter, because I expected more from them, you know. I didn't expect anything from Tories, you know. They just acted the way I expected them to act.
Still are.
You know, so I always found I would never slavishly defend the Labour Party if I thought they should be doing more or doing better, I was always pretty critical. You don't get that anymore. You know, everything's just a binary consideration, and you know, the whataboutery doesn't just extend to football, it extends to political parties.
Social media's got a lot to do with that as well. It's black and white, and I mean, it's definitely something. I think the biggest politically it's different. I've never been a member of a party. I've always just been.
I'm not anymore, I hasten to add.
I've never been a member of a party, but from a supporting football team point of view, was the moment that I realised I was disposable.
Aye.
And they wouldn't care if I was there or no. It was a big eye opener for me. And then when I got that, I was like, I probably started to question more and more, even more than what I did in the 90s. Because I just wanted to go to the games in the 90s. We were talking about 1980. Innocent. I just wanted Celtic to win this cup in 1980. Just wanted us to win it. But even in the 90s, I just left school. I was into it was Britpop. The music was fantastic.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go to the games. I wasn't really interested in the fact that we were nearly out of business. And now when I stand back and admit that, folk look at me and go, really? I go, aye. I just wanted to go to the games. Aye. I just wanted to win games of football.
Aye. And won.
Aye.
The feeling that when you won, you're right.
I just wanted that. I says, now you look back, and I'm always thankful for guys like Save Our Celts and Celts for Change and all that, guys that were more political minded in my time than what I was at that I was at that point. But I've got to a point with the modern game now. I go, maybe it's just me getting older. I go, I want to go back to the 1980 Cup Final where everything was just innocent. You turned up, played a game of football, and that was it.
Yeah.
But this was a beginning of the end of Scottish football as we know it.
I think so.
Because of what happened in the final.
Yeah, and I think you know, even that's the first game I can ever really recall thinking about the level of hatred between the fans, particularly. I think, you know, again, you can only look at these things honestly. I think the hatred from a Rangers perspective in the other direction, you know, that's the first time I can ever really remember feeling shocked and a bit dismayed about all that. Not because it played out as a battle on the pitch, you know, but just that feeling of being a bad loser, you know.
Archie McPherson's commentary actually says that. He says, make no bones about this, these two set of fans hate each other as the riot is unfolding live on the telly in front of them.
Yeah.
We'll talk. Everybody knows the game. The Celtic team that day was Latchford, Snedden, McGrain, Aiken, Conroy, McLeod, Provan, Doyle, who was replaced by Bobby Lennox. This was Bobby Lennox's last ever game for Celtic. Right. George McCluskey, Tommy Burns and Frank McGarvey. That Celtic front line for me is full of skill. McCluskey and McGarvey were just like a bag of tricks. The Rangers team, you've got McCloy, Sandy Jardine, Dawson, Stevens, Jackson, Forsyth, Cooper, Russell, Johnson, Smith, McDonald, and Tommy McLean comes on as a sub. So the teams are not really that much different. It was a game of few chances. I think Celtic edge it on the day. You know the winner.
I think Rangers actually played quite well that day. I think even a terrible season. But
both teams had chances. When I look back at the footage, everything Rangers done well came through Cooper.
Yeah.
Everything it done. Celtic as well. Everything came down to the skill of McGarvey, McCluskey up front, giving the Rangers back line a torrid time. The winner comes for a corner kick where Davy Provan wins the corner, and he looks knackered when he's ready to put the ball in. He puts the ball in. It's cleared, breaks to Danny McGrain. McGrain swipes it at McCluskey, flicks it into the back of the net.
And McLeod doesn't save it.
He doesn't save it, no. McCloy doesn't save it.
There's a theme coming here.
There was over 70,000 there that day.
Yeah.
And it's still a game when you're actually looking at, maybe this shows you the vastness of Hampden. There were still empty spaces. You can still see
when you're standing on the terrace.
Especially down the front, behind the Rangers goal when Celtic score. There's this the usual wee laddies just peering through,
over the wall,
through the fence and stuff like that. When Celtic score and there's a camera angle for behind the goals, there's a mushroom cloud goes up of the dust rising for the terrace, and obviously it's been a really, really hot day and a really hot couple of weeks, and you just see this mushroom cloud coming up, and the camera's engulfed in this dust and whatever else was on the terrace, and again, that just gives you something. Like when you look back and go, that wouldn't happen again. You didn't really want it to happen, because everybody that went to games in the 80s have got a story about, by the way, you could have got crushed to death that day. It's like
easily
another nightmare. My worst one was at Hampden, 85 Cup Final, when the turnstiles broke down at the front and the police just decided to open the gates and let you go through. Now, this game, you were allowed to drink at this game, you're allowed to take carry-outs in at this game. My dad will often tell me about taking like 24 cans to watch 90 minutes of football into these games with him. This game, it will be 42 years this year.
Jesus.
So that was the game that alcohol was banned from Scottish football. Is it time to move on now? Have we had time to move on? You mentioned something there about Rangers this day. I mean, everybody knows how it started. Some Celtic fans came on the pitch to celebrate with the players. The players were over the moon. Then, and what I says to you before we actually came on, when you actually look when the Rangers fans come on the pitch, there's hardly any Rangers fans in the stadium.
Aye.
The ones that were left in the stadium ended up on the pitch. But out of the 70,000 crowd that day, say there's 35,000 each, you're talking about there's maybe only 2,000 or 3,000 Rangers fans left in the stadium when the riot actually starts. Again, that's a small minority. It is a minority of the fans that are on, but there's more Celtic fans there. So when the Celtic fans end up coming on the pitch, it looks like a charge of green and white. Yeah. It looks quite cartoonish now.
It does
sometimes when you look at it, when you just look at the fashion, and it does look cartoonish. It looks Bay City Rollers-ish.
Yeah,
when you actually see it.
It was shocking at the time. You know, I was watching it on TV. I wasn't at the game, and. You know, it's one of those things that you do definitely remember, you know, and think there's going to be a lot of trouble at the end of this, you know, in terms of trouble for the clubs, you know, and how that's going to play out. I think I used to despair about stuff like that, I have to be honest. Even then, you know, I was only 16 at the time. But I'd never had any time for the kind of sectarian aspect. Maybe because I did leave Glasgow when I was so young, you know. I'm reading Bobby Gillespie's book at the minute. And Bobby Gillespie still alive. He's a wee bit older than me, but we were at the same primary school at the same time. He's maybe 3 years older than me, Mount Florida, just at the bottom there. And he talks a lot about being a Celtic fan in the context of having to always watch, the older you get, having to always watch where you are and what street you're in, and you know, you're generally all right if you stay within your own confines. I missed all of that, you know. I don't have the same kind of memories of being chased or feeling that I was going to get battered by. Maybe there's a lot of that because, you know, Rangers and Kilmarnock, I don't remember there being a lot of Celtic fans, you know. So you've got a different perspective. But watching that, it was genuinely shocking. And in a way that it might not have been for people who'd grown up, particularly Celtic fans, maybe being a bit more victimised in parts of the city. But my first thought, and I know we were talking about this earlier on, my first thought was, you lose a cup final. Why are you still in? Why would you stay to watch someone else, another team, picking up the trophy?
I know. You know? As I say, that was one of the things that I noticed. And you're having a look at it. There's a camera angle, and it's for the big match footage. Yeah. And I will talk about the big match footage because the album I'm going to talk about is a Joy Division album. And the way the big match footage edits the Riot together. It's all jerky, strange camera angles, jumping all about the place. And I could just picture shadow play across the top of it, and it getting played out in slow motion. Like the way, there's a Polish charger, and there's a France charger, there's a Polish, and it just the way it was. But that's the thing that I noticed was, there was hardly anybody in the Rangers end when the Riot actually started. And my dad was there that day. And he says he was standing in the north enclosure, just watching it. And he says then a bottle flew over his head, and him and his pal went, "It's time for us to go."
We better go.
Or that they're chucking stuff at us now. It's time for us to move. And when you actually do it, when you actually do see it, it is horrible to watch. It is really like unfiltered 1987 violence with bottles and like it is quite terrible to watch. And I think that's why the 2016 Cup Final as well really shocked people, because you hadn't seen that level
there's an element of here it's happening again.
You hadn't seen that level of, we've all seen fights in streets, we've all seen, but to actually see it on a football stadium on that stage was really quite shocking. You speak about it, both clubs have had incidences over the last couple of years, and I think we're now getting towards the end of possibly lockdown. And if you look at the end of the Spanish flu, you then had the rip-roaring 20s where the excess was prevalent. It really was. Is it time for football clubs to actually bring alcohol back in? Because we're 42 years now down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I over the last few years, I've probably actually gone to see Chelsea more than I've gone to see Rangers, you know. A lot of reasons for that. I think my son played football to a good standard, and then coached, does a wee bit still with Kilmarnock Football Club. So they're just along the road from us, and I would occasionally go, and I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Kilmarnock anyway, because I know a lot of the people that run the club, and that, you know, mates that are fairly supportive of it, you know, and I can't say I'm a supporter, but you know, I like Kilmarnock to do well, so I would occasionally go and see them because he had tickets, or you know, but we'd always make a point of going down to see Stamford Bridge if we could, and it's just a different atmosphere, you know, at a game down there. And we were down at Chelsea Man United, just before Christmas, Sunday night, and you know, you're going, and there's a wee bit of nervousness about it, just because of the COVID thing. Do you know what I mean? You know, you're aware of the fact that this variant's on the rise and everything, so everybody's jammed in, and it's Chelsea have started with a safe standing in the shed end, so we're in the shed end. And I've listened to, you know, Chelsea fans who've also not got the greatest of reputations at times, but the abuse that they're singing at Man United, the referee, Ronaldo, all the rest of it, I think this is really quite tame, you know. Yeah, I've been to Rangers and Celtic games where it is, you know, it's really bad at times, you know. And you think you can drink at the games down there, you know. It probably is time to maybe try and hopefully make people feel a wee bit more mature, and maybe they'll respond a bit better. And you know, to be honest, I mean, people going to go to a game drunk, they're going to go to a game drunk.
There's a binge culture in Scotland that I see at football, and all the years I've been going to football, you see it. Even now, when you go to games, you'll get the young team in the toilets at half time trying to down a bottle of Buckfast that they've brought in to try and get back out. There is, we'll just have one more pint instead of going in the ground at 2:30. We'll try and get in at 1:55 and stuff like that, and maybe having some form of alcohol on sale in the ground would alleviate that.
I mean, that's you know, a societal thing, really, that's always been there, I think. You know, drink, football and politics are kind of... And sectarianism, let's kind of get away from it in Glasgow, are central to the identity of how most Glaswegians, my age anyway, understand the city, do you know? It's not that there's other balancing fantastic things about Glasgow and the city, But these are the bits that I think
definitely.
Your only hope as you get older is that we somehow find a way to gravitate away from that, you know, without losing the grittiness and the attitude that makes it what it is. Do you know?
I do think a lot of the incidents that over the last few years have mainly been maybe blown out of proportion because they're that rare now that if something happens. Before the last Celtic Rangers game, I think there was an incident outside a pub in Glasgow. When you actually watch the footage, you're like, well, there's nothing really. But then you've got George Square, and stuff like that, and you go, there's always, football is always seen, especially if you want to get political, by the SNP government, as it's always treated as a second-class citizen, and it's always, no, we'll go for you first. You hear it the day the Six Nations are starting soon, and what a wonderful occasion that is, and you're going, well, football's a wonderful occasion for 8% of the country that go every week to watch a game. So surely,
if only that's all it was, you know, if only it happened in a park. And you got invested in everything, you know, to whatever level. I mean, there's nothing like your team winning a game of football.
No,
you know,
definitely, it's brilliant.
Especially when you don't expect it to happen. Do you know, it's the greatest feeling there is. But it would be great. You've got to balance that because they can't win all the time, you know. And learning how to deal with that, both those sides, I think, is something that I think as Rangers fans, I would prefer it was better for us to do, do you know? And I know that draws you into the line of criticism as to what the club actually represents. And that point I was making earlier on, is it a magnet for people who see it representing other things that are maybe a bit more malignant, or is it actually something that has gravitated its identity to suit the supporters that it's got? I think it's the former, I have to be honest. I think there are good people running the club. I think there's a whole range of good people who support the club and who'll talk intelligently about what it means to them and what they would want it to be in the future. But there's another aspect of attraction for... There's
a historical baggage.
Well, it's become an emblem for issues that are really nothing to do with football, and I think for those issues to gain any kind of credence, the people who feel like that need to be part of something bigger, you know.
But sometimes as well, both football clubs are maybe guilty of appealing to the lowest common denominator when they're trying to get cash out of us.
And I you know, I can only really talk about Rangers from that point of view, but sometimes
I can only talk about Celtic from that point of view as well.
You know, there's no point in not tackling the difficult issues in your own club. I think one of the best ways of looking at these kind of things is, well, you know, deal with your own problem. Other people's issues are their own, you know. I sometimes think that there's been occasions and opportunities, and really, to be honest, going to the third division was the biggest opportunity of all.
2012 was the opportunity to hit restart.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the developing a football academy with young players rather than bringing in expensive players. I think sometimes it always felt like, you know, we're going to prove a point here. We're going to go into every game and we're going to batter these teams 7-6-0, 7-0. But you're bringing in players that, you know, whose careers they're past it, you know, and it was never going to happen. And when you go down that route, there's always going to be criticism, because if they'd played young boys and they'd been winning narrowly, but at least they were developing something and building something that wasn't costing a lot of money, then football fans get behind that, you know.
Definitely, as long as they've got something to buy into. Football fans do buy into it. They definitely do. We missed an opportunity when Rangers were in the third division to actually develop our academy and stuff like that. We never done it. We didn't want to do it. We just... For me, I've said often enough that we just flirted with the fact that we could be a Champions League club without even actually making a decent attempt to be a Champions League club, and that's what we eventually paid the price for that. We did eventually paid a price for our laziness. I think. Now, you mentioned in 1979, that you were a bit political.
I became political.
You became political in 1979, and I think this is reflected in the album that you've chosen from that year. So the album that you've chosen is The Jam Setting Suns, which was the 4th studio album by the Jam. And talk us through it. Why has this got a major influence in your life?
That album just spoke to me, I think, in a way that it got me at the right time. I mean, I think it came out November 1979, so it was pretty
16th of November 1979.
Pretty close to the end of the year. I was interested in music. My dad, there was always music going on in the house. My dad was a Johnny Cash fan, Glenn Campbell fan. So there was always kind of music in the background. I was friendly with an older kid from upstairs, the flat upstairs, and he was a punk. So I kind of got access, even though I was a bit young for punk, I kind of got access to Ramones albums and stuff, and he started playing things like this, and we kind of got into music from that way. And he was a wee bit kind of, the Jam are a wee bit antiseptic for him, I think, when they first came out. But 4 or 5 of us got, that was the first gig I'd been to, 1979 with the Jam, and I went with this group of kids, most of whom were a wee bit older than me, and it was amazing. And I the singles, I liked the singles, but at that time, probably, I thought everything that Paul Weller's writing down here, I was always really interested in the lyrics, Do you
think that the fact that your pal found them antiseptic was down to Weller's lyrics?
No, I think probably...
Or were they just too pop?
Probably, and I think, I mean, I don't agree with this at all, but I think as they became more popular, I think there was a wee bit of a feeling that you can't be popular and great. I think the Jam were the best band in Britain for probably about 2 or 3 years around this period.
Paul,
nobody touched them.
Weller was prolific, and the band were prolific. I'm younger at that time, but the influence of the Jam on my early years is massive, because you heard them on the radio all the time.
Yeah.
And they were always on Top of the Pops. They were always on Top of the Pops with a big thing. And you would go to the youth club disco or the church hall disco on a Saturday night at between 6 and 8 o'clock, and the Jam would come on, and you'd be jumping off the seats and that, and madness. There was a definitely alternative culture was in mainstream at that point.
Definitely. And they were kind of everywhere as well. Like they're selling
Weller's young, good looking is like
records a week or something like that. But anyway, just that there was something about that record, and I think you're at 15, probably for the first time starting to feel comfortable with mates that I had, given that I wasn't from that area, and that there was probably a few years when I moved down to Kilmarnock where things were quite difficult. You're trying to find your way. Early teens, it's not easy. You eventually find it through football and playing football, and music was the thing that galvanised me with the mates that I had then. I'd probably still people that I'm in touch with really closely now, and it all came down to that record, I think.
Brilliant.
And the background theme about it's kind of resonated with me for a long time, about young people who've got hopes and dreams, and I know it's never quite panned out as the concept album I think that he wanted it to be, but this whole thing about what does friendship mean to you, and
Thick as Thieves,
what's your that connection that you've got with other people, and I kind of sense that you've got the whole world at your feet, you're just not entirely sure what to do with that thought. That stuck with me for a long time. I mean, if here's a quick plug for one of the books. If it hadn't been for Setting Suns, I wouldn't have written that book, that first one.
This one?
Aye.
The Last Days of Disco?
Yeah.
You wouldn't have... So, why did Setting Suns
kind of an attempt. Well, it's picking up that theme of, being the 2 central characters in that book are 18. Are just either about to leave school or, no idea what they're going to do. Thatcher's Britain is in full flow at that point, whereas at Setting Suns it was only just beginning. Nobody quite knew it was coming. But when Last Days of Disco is really set in around that 6 months when the Falklands emerges,
right.
you know, and the two central characters, one of them is an older brother who had joined up the army the year before and ends up having to go to the Falkland Islands. And, you know, you've the song in Setting Sun's Little Boy Soldiers, I think is quite prescient about, you know, the ability to look forward. I know he was talking about a different kind of war, but it's really conflict of any kind. Yeah.
Because Weller's concept wasn't a time framed.
No,
it was just a war. That was his concept.
I mean, it's probably my favourite song on the album, Little Boy Soldiers. Just that whole thing about the way the lyrics work, and you know, the only contact that we've got is a form for the election. You need me to do something for you. It's brilliant. He was only 21 at the time. You know? Which is amazing,
which is really, really frightening when I look back on it, that Weller done all of this and he split up the Jam by the time he was 23. But he had crammed so much into his career at that point. Yeah. It was utterly phenomenal. I love Thick as Thieves on this. I love Thick as Thieves. For me, this album, this is the most Jam album where Weller is as close to Pete Townsend. Like obviously the Who have been a massive influence. Quadrophenia was out the year the film Quadrophenia was out the year before. Yeah. And so maybe that's got Paul Weller's.
Even the back covers, like bulldog sitting on the beach at Brighton, stuff like that, and you just expect Jimmy to come wandering up the beach.
Definitely. I mean, the whole concept thing, that was a Who, so Paul's probably thinking round about that. I can do it. And there's certain songs on the album, like Thick as Thieves, Saturday Kids, and that. Yeah. His voice is very Daltley. It's very Townsend. You can just be the storytelling that he's given that. I love this as a Jam album. I really do love it as a Jam album. But everybody's always say Eating Rifles, because that was a big, massive single that's on it. And that song's still relevant today, even though it was written in 1978, 1979. Yeah.
Well, it's relevant and sad insofar as nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed.
You know, in terms of how you get your leaders, it's depressing. It's
how he managed to see that. At that point, and it's something when everybody just thinks, oh, it's a great song, it's got a bouncy bass line, it's bloody fantastic. Then as you get older, I remember dancing to that, as I say, at like youth club discos and that, and it isn't until you're older and you're maybe 18, 19 and you're sitting and it comes on the pub jukebox, because there was always some old mod would go and put jam songs on the jukebox, and you started listening to it, you're like, wait a minute, that's actually going underground. I mean, I loved Down at the Tube Station at Midnight. How he managed to fit that story in that song is, again, that's not on this album, and I've went off a tangent there. But it's
that's an interesting point though, because you know one of the criticisms that's always kind of levied at Setting Suns is that the concept was a great idea, but he just run out of songs. You know, so you stick Martha and Vandel's cover on at the end.
It's a great cover,
I don't subscribe to that at all, you know, because Strangetown and when you're young were out just immediately either side, and then going underground, and you know what might be arguably one of the greatest Jam songs, the Dreams of Children, on the other side of it. They're not on any of these albums. Do you know? I think it's just about probably mood. You know, Heatwave was. I mean, a lot of the Last Days of Disco's far more autobiographical, as you know, people's first books tend to be, and a lot of the things that go on in that are very closely related to what happened when my mate and I started a mobile disco and Kilmarnock, and we called it Heatwave, and it was after that song, and we used to start every gig with that song, strobe lighting, and you know, none of us could play any musical instrument, so that was as close as we ever got to being in a band, you know. But the power of that song when you started with smoke machines and the strobe lights and stuff like that, it was phenomenal.
It's a great take. It's a great version of it. It's an absolute fantastic version of it.
And you know, every other album before that had a cover version on it. You'd Slow Down in the first one, in the Midnight Hour, David Watts. You know, it was kind of in keeping with the way he was structuring the albums at that time. Do you know?
It was a. You're thinking back to albums at that time. Most of them had covers, had at least one cover on it where they would go, and we're going to take this and change it. And the version of Smithers Jones on this, I love that song.
It's good. That's definitely Bruce Foxton's best.
I love, and the orchestra that they use in the orchestra, it's brilliant. Again, you didn't get bands like that now. I mean, Paul Weller. Do you think Paul Weller gets the credit he deserves as a national treasure?
Probably now, I think, I mean, you know, it's a difficult question for me to answer because Paul Weller's my hero, you know, and I don't have any problem.
Why do you think you didn't get it then when I was for about 85 onwards?
Because I think a lot of people,
Wildwood came out.
I think there was a lot of resistance from the traditional mod environment against the Style Council, you know.
I love the Style Council.
People just didn't get it, you know. I loved it as well, and I think that I've been asked this question a lot actually about Paul Weller. I think all the way through my life, there's been various, you know, changes to the way he's put music out that have been far more relevant to me at that time. You know, like when I was younger, and I had mates, we were all Jam fans. And then you get older and you think, I can't say that it didn't feel like a death in the family when he split the band up. Mm-hmm. But I kind of quickly got over that because my girlfriend then, who's my wife now, she liked the Style Council, you know. So from having a group of mates who follow the Jam around the country when they're touring and queue up waiting for every record to come out, all of a sudden I'm starting to go to the Style Council with my girlfriend at that time, and you're getting a bit older and relationships become more important. And then, you know, moving into the solo years, the lyrics are less political, they're a wee bit more personal, and I was a father for the first time round about that. Do you know what I mean? It's like every life, period of his output, he's been writing and talking about things that are directly relevant to where I've been at the time. Now, you can look at that and think, am I truly stereotypical? Is everybody just the same? Or am I looking for something in that output?
Maybe a bit of both.
Probably.
It could be a bit of both. It's just that you're looking for some, this guy's been a hero to you, and he's maybe is talking, and you're finding meaning from his songs. And if you were ever lucky enough to meet him and you say that to him, you'll go, that's great. That's how I want my music to be interpreted and to actually mean something to.
We might have to get in touch with him soon. We've got the national. That book was acquired by National Theatre Scotland.
This initially, one, Last Days of Disco.
For a stage musical.
Right.
Johnny McKnight wrote the script. It's now out of that period because they've kind of moved on, but we're trying to get the script into development at the minute, and it's Jam songs that are at the background of it, you know. So his script's phenomenal. It's just a question of, you know, we get to a point where we start to think that here's the development of all this happening. COVID hits, you know, you can't put it on anywhere. And then how can you fund, you know, it's quite difficult to fund culture things now, but Borderline, Air Gaiety are behind it, and Johnny's quite happy for the script to be. So you never know.
So you've went from, you're an architect by trade.
Yeah.
That's what you've trained at. So at what point did you go, I'm going to write a book? When did you actually? When did that come into your head? And you've already said that you were heavily influenced by Weller and the Jam and Setting Suns. Yeah. So when did The Last Day of Disco become ferment in your head, become your idea?
Probably around about 2010, I think. Again, you know, I mentioned earlier on about reading Bobby Gillespie's book, and I was quite curious. He talks a lot about childhood trauma and you know, going into therapy and stuff like that. And I found later in life, probably around about that time, that I'd buried a whole load of feelings about my mum dying. I could never really talk to my dad. He was kind of West of Scotland railwayman who, you know, never really talked about feelings and stuff like that, you know. So I just buried all of that, and I found, I can't remember why, there's no point even looking for the trigger for it now, but I can't remember what the trigger for all that was, but I felt pretty depressed when I was at a point in time, maybe late 2007, 2008. So I decided that talking about it and going to therapy was something that I kind of really needed to do, otherwise it was going to just destroy me, you know. So I went, couldn't figure it out for myself, and it was a suggestion from someone who'd said, if you're finding it difficult to talk, why don't you write it down, you know, speak to your dad, write it down, you know. And at the time we were working overseas quite a lot. I was in really unusual places like Libya for 4 years, in China, and a lot of places where you're there for maybe 3 weeks at a time, and nobody speaks English, and there's not that much to do. And I kind of thought, right, I'm going to start writing things down. I'd written articles on design before, but never anything fictional, and I found it really cathartic, you know. And it was about writing, trying to reconnect with that time when I felt, you know, everything was great for the first time, 1979, 1988, 182, and putting down something that would represent how I felt about life, but from a fictional perspective, so you could be that one removed, you know. So that was kind of how it started. But I never thought for a minute, honestly never thought that it was going to be published, or that I even wanted it to be published. It was more about the act of doing it, first and foremost. How it came to be published is a really weird story. If we'll digress slightly, and I'll tell you, Twitter is responsible for it being published. And in the early days of Twitter, when I thought it was really a really creative outlet, there's a few people that I'm sure you guys connect with as well. Paul Thompson, who's a Celtic fan. Paul. We started doing this. I'd never met him at that point, but we'd started this idea about creating a fictional character from the East End of Glasgow, and called Bobby Soonis, funnily enough.
That's where I first met your work, was Bobby Soonis. Putting
it on Twitter and trying to write these daft wee stories on a tweet a day and stuff, and it was really good. It kind of took off, and a lot of people gravitated towards it. And one of the people, the accounts that was following it for a while was a publishing company in London called Arcadia Books. I knew nothing about them, but they'd interact. They'd say, "This is really good. It's really funny." And then at one point, Karen Sullivan, I didn't know it was Karen at the time, but my publisher contacted me and said, "We've acquired this book, and it's not really, I like it. It's not really what we do. Would you read it, you know, and tell us what you think of it?" Because they knew I was interested in football and obviously the writing and stuff. And I said no to start with, and she kind of badgered me a wee bit. So eventually I said, "Look, send me it." I said, "This is not what I do. I'm not a book reviewer, you know, and I don't want to be disrespectful to somebody who's written this. But send me it." I was going to work in Singapore, and I said, "I'll take it with me. I'll read it in the plane. If it connects, then I'll give you something." So the book was called Fan, and it was Danny Rhodes was the author, and it was a kind of fictional story behind the trauma of a Nottingham Forest fan at Hillsborough,
right?
And the feelings that came out of that. So I read it, and it was really, really well written. You know, I probably didn't know that much about how you review books at that time, but it struck a bit of a personal connection with me, because my dad and his family had been at the Ibrox disaster, and they'd got separated at the end of the game, and he'd gone to the pub, and of course, you know, there's loads of stories like this. You know, their families thought they were maybe involved because there was no phones, nobody turned up. That, you know, so much later on when he got back, no knowing what had happened. You know, and my mum died a year later. My dad loved Rangers. You know, Rangers daft. Never went to another game after that. And it was always that kind of feeling. I could never understand that. And as I say, we didn't talk a lot about feelings, but I could never understand how you could give up something that you loved that much. And it just, you know, I think with my mum dying, it was probably just a perspective thing, you know. It's not actually that important. And it was only really through reading Danny's book that I kind of, it almost made me feel like I got that about my dad for the first time, you know. So I sent him, I wrote a wee comment about how this connected on a personal level, and Danny really liked it. They were quite grateful, and eventually I had said, because I thought, if I don't say it now, I'm never going to say it. I've got something here. Could I maybe send you this to read? Anyway, Karen tells that story now. You know, I think her heart sank. That feeling that she's going to have to read this and it's going to be absolute shite, and she's going to have to come back and say,
no, no.
But no, she.
And have they been your publisher since?
Well, that wasn't actually the end of that story, funnily enough, because Arcadia Books offered me a deal about a week after I'd sent it down, and sent me a contract up. And I'm kind of used to looking at contracts for architecture and stuff like that. So I took about 3 months to go through this, trying to understand it. Had asked, you know, our lawyers inside the company, tell me what this means and all the rest of it. And by the time I'd got round to signing this, Karen had left to start up her own publishing house, Arenda Books. And if I'd signed that, she says to me, I've never known anybody, I've 30 years of publishing, she'd never known anybody to take that long to sign a publishing contract. Folk just normally sign it and don't bother reading it, you know. They're that delighted to get offered something. If I'd signed that for Arcadia Books, they would just have sat in it. They would never have published it, you know, and none of those would be sitting there now. So I was really fortunate that I think I was the first. It wasn't the first book published by Arenda, but I think I was the first author signed to it. And it's gone from strength to strength.
Brilliant.
So I don't know that I would actually write for anybody else now, to be honest.
If you've got a working relationship with them and you're both comfortable with each other, why would you?
That's true.
That's the bottom line. So, where can people purchase this if they want to find out more about you? Where did they go?
All good bookstores, a few bad ones. If you're ordering and you don't want to stick the money into Jeff Bezos's pocket, then you can order direct from Arenda Books' website, arendabooks.co.uk.
So that's where everybody can get your stuff.
Yeah.
Perfect. David, this has been absolutely magnificent. I've really enjoyed this, man. Nice wee Blair on a Monday afternoon.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for coming in. And thank you for being a guest on SCREAMACELICA.
No problem, and I hope we'll maybe invite me back, regardless of what the score is on Wednesday night.
Definitely, you're welcome back anytime, David. Welcome back anytime. Thank you very much.
No problem, thanks,
Cheers.
Kevin. Cheers.